One.
Good afternoon, and welcome to our sixth and final lecture in the series Reimagining Black History Month. I'm very excited about this speaker we have today, Richard Rothstein, the author of The Color of Law. We are right now dealing with a very oppressive laws and policies and rules that disproportionately affect people of color. This has been a complaint of people of color for quite some time. What the color of law shows us is that we did not get here by accident. It's important that we understand how we got here and what we need to do to try to move through it. Again, as I mentioned in the first lecture, Reimagining Black History Month is about reimagining how we approach Black History Month. We do celebrate the triumphs and the victories and the heroes of the past, but we have to realize that Black history is being made every day of the year. The murder of Black bodies is Black history. Disproportionate discrimination in housing is Black history. Mortgage laws and redlining is Black history. They all contribute to how we got here today. So it is my hope that we open our hearts and minds and listen to what Richard Rothstein has to tell us today and figure out moving forward, what are we going to do about it? Richard Rothstein is the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. In addition to his recent book, The Color of Law, he is the author of many other articles and books on race and education, which can be found at his webpage at the Economic Policy Institute, www.epi.org/people/Richard-Rothstein. Previous influential books include Class in Schools, Using Social and Economic Educational Improvement to Close the Black and White Achievement Gap, and Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right. He welcomes questions and comments at riroth@epi.org. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Richard Rothstein. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you very much, Lionel. Let me first, I don't want to disappoint you, but let me tell you I'm going to be talking about this afternoon is not Black history, but American history. It's white history. It's the history of how this country came to be a segregated, apartheid-like society. And this is not a problem that is a Black people's problem. It's a problem of all of us. In the 20th century, as I'm sure you know, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in law schools and then in colleges and universities. And then in 1954, it persuaded the Supreme Court to prohibit legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And then that Brown decision, Brown versus Board of Education decision, inspired a movement of activists, of people who engaged in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. So some people lost their lives in that struggle. And by the end of the 1960s, that movement had pretty much persuaded much of the country that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to Blacks and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. And with that understanding, the civil rights movement succeeded in abolishing segregation in public accommodations, in public transportation, in employment. And in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it succeeded in getting a Fair Housing Act passed that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And then the civil rights movement ended and left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area of this country is residentially segregated. There are clearly defined areas in every one of them that are either all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that are either all black or mostly black. How could it be? If we came to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both African Americans and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy, how could it be that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? I think partly it's because desegregating neighborhoods is hard. If we prohibit segregation of lunch counters or buses, as we did in the 20th century, in the 1960s, the next day you can go to any restaurant you want or sit anywhere you want on a bus. But if we passed a law prohibiting the segregation of neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, Democrats, Republicans, is we've adopted a rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for failing to redress this biggest segregation of all. And the excuse, the rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation of colleges and universities and interstate transportation and public accommodations, that was all done by government. If the federal government was imposing segregation on some sector of American society, that was a violation of the Fifth Amendment, a civil rights violation, something that as American citizens, we all have an obligation to remedy. If state and local governments were doing it, that was also a civil rights violation, a violation of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and something we have an obligation to do something about. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves, that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. That wasn't done by law, by regulation, by public policy. That's just sort of happened naturally. It happened by accident. That's the reason we have segregated neighborhoods. Maybe bigoted white homeowners or landlords refuse to sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe businesses in the private economy, not government, but banks, real estate agencies, developers, discriminated in how they provided housing for American families. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just because blacks and whites like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. Or maybe it's all because of income differences. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites on average. It's not true in all cases, but on average it's true. And many African Americans can't afford to move to middle-class white neighborhoods. All of these individual, bigoted, but private sector actions, self-choice, self-segregation, income differences, that's what's created residential segregation. And we tell ourselves that what happened naturally, what happened by accident, what happened by the private sector can only be undone by them. We give a name to this rationalization. We say that what we've got, and it's a name we all use, what we've got in this country is de facto segregation, something that just happened in fact, but not in law. Well, I spent most of my time before writing this book, The Color of Law, writing about education policy, not about housing. And in the 1990s and 2000s, I came to understand that the education policy that this country was following made no sense. What we were telling ourselves, and this was again across the political spectrum, it wasn't Democrats or Republicans, what we were telling ourselves is that the reason that there was an achievement gap in schools, that African American children had lower average achievement than white children. The reason for that was the teachers had low expectations of black children. They just didn't try very hard to educate them. And if we could force teachers in schools to try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. We passed a law in 2001 called the No Child Left Behind Act, which required that schools test children every year in math and reading and hold teachers in schools accountable for those test scores. And the law predicted that if we did that, within 7 years, teachers would be forced to try harder and the achievement gap would disappear. It was a ludicrous theory to begin with. It did not accomplish anything that it promised. We still have the achievement gap today, and as great a large an amount as we had 20 years ago when the law was passed. I tried to explain that the reason that we have an achievement gap between African American and white children is not because of low teacher expectations. Of course, there are some teachers who don't try very hard. That's true in any profession. But the reason that average African American achievement is so much lower than white average achievement is because of the social and economic conditions that Black children come to school from. So, for example, I wrote one column in the New York Times about asthma. As you may know, African American children in urban neighborhoods have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children. 4 times the rate. It's an enormous difference. And they have asthma at such a higher rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more trucks driving by their homes, spewing smoke, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment, empty lots kicking up dust. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't have asthma to wake up at night wheezing, be sleepless the next day when the child comes to school, drowsy. And if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, the same racial composition of the groups, same social and economic backgrounds, same family structure, same economic situation, but one group has a higher rate of asthma, that group is going to have a lower average achievement level simply because it's going to be drowsier than the group that does not have asthma. Now, this doesn't make a big difference. It doesn't explain very much of the achievement gap, a tiny part of it. But then you begin to think of all of the other conditions that children from socially and economically disadvantaged families, particularly African American children, come to school with, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning because of poorly maintained buildings. Lead poisoning has a measurable impact on IQ, or homelessness, or economic insecurity. And you begin to add all of these up. Each one of them, you can do the same kind of analysis as you do for asthma. When you begin to add all of them up, you've pretty much explained the achievement gap. The teacher expectations, how hard teachers try, has very little to do with it. Something, there's some bad teachers, but not much. Well, I was beginning to think about this, and then I realized that it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. It's another thing if every child in the school has one or more of these conditions. How can a school like that ever be expected to achieve at the same level as a school where children come well-rested, well-nourished, in good health, breathing clean air? You can't have that expectation, no matter how many laws you pass, requiring the achievement gap to disappear. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children like that, with all of these serious social and economic disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they ever have been in the last 45 years, more segregated. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think that maybe neighborhood segregation was a school problem. That's how I came to this topic that led to the book, The Color of Law. Housing policy must be educational policy as well. And in 2007, as I was thinking about this, I read a Supreme Court decision. It concerned 2 school districts, Seattle, Washington, and Louisville, Kentucky. Both of them had a very, very trivial school desegregation plan. They gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to intensify segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child that wouldn't do that. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school, and both a Black and a white child applied for the last remaining place in that school, the Black child would be given some preference to help to desegregate the school. This was a trivial program. You don't have one place left in the school very often, and both a Black and a white child apply for it. But the Supreme Court analyzed this program, denounced it, said you couldn't do such a thing. The controlling decision was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. Justice Roberts explained that it's true, he said, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. But he said they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. He was right about that. And then he went on to say that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle are segregated de facto, was the term he used, because of private bigotry and actions of businesses in the private economy and people's self-choice and income differences. And he said, well, you have de facto segregation, something that the government was not involved in creating. Government is prohibited under the Constitution from doing anything to change it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered reading about something that happened in Louisville, Kentucky some years before. In Louisville, there was a white homeowner in a single family home in an all-white suburb just outside of Louisville called Shively. That white homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child. He wanted to move to a single family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner bought a second home in his suburb of Shively and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob of white neighbors surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. Police made no effort to stop this. They firebombed and dynamited the home. The police made no effort to stop that. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence the white homeowner for sedition. I thought about this and I said, this doesn't sound to me much like the de facto segregation that John Roberts insists created segregation in Louisville, Kentucky. The police, the prosecutors, the judges, the courts are agents of the state. This is not private activity. This is state-sponsored violence to drive African Americans out of homes that they legitimately purchased in white neighborhoods. And I began to look into it further, and I found there were hundreds and hundreds of cases like this in communities all over the country, in Detroit, in Chicago, in Cleveland, in New York, in Denver, in Kansas City, in Los Angeles, and San Francisco, everywhere. There were instances of police-protected, sometimes police-led and organized, violence against African Americans who had moved into white neighborhoods. Every one of these cases, and there were hundreds of them, every one of these was a civil rights violation, a violation of the Constitution of the 14th Amendment. Every one of them requires us as American citizens to remedy it, and we've never accepted that responsibility. Well, I then began to look into this further, and I found that it wasn't just state-sponsored violence that created the segregation that we know today, but there were many, many federal, state, and local policies explicitly designed with racial intent, explicit intent, designed to ensure that blacks and whites could not live near one another anywhere in any metropolitan area of this country. I will describe a few of them. There are so many of them, and I describe in the color of law, but I'll describe a few of them this afternoon to you. When you've read this account, this history, you will have to conclude that de facto segregation is an utter myth. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. We have a government-constructed system of racial segregation, really an apartheid system, that we have an obligation as American citizens to fix. Well, let me begin by describing one program of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the period immediately after World War II, when millions of returning war veterans were coming home needing housing, and when blacks and whites, many of them, were living in broadly integrated neighborhoods in downtown urban areas. There was a lot more integration then than there is today. We'd be stunned if we were transported back to that time to see the extent of integration that existed. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration embarked upon a program to move the entire white working class population into single-family homes in all white suburbs, and to prohibit African Americans from doing the same thing. Perhaps the most famous of these projects, these suburbs that were created by the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, is Leveetown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place, just east of New York. An enormous project. No bank would be crazy enough to lend Levitt the money to build this project. He tried and tried and tried. No bank would lend him the money. We weren't a suburban country at that time. Most African Americans and whites were living in urban areas. We were a manufacturing economy. Factories needed to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts or ship their final products. And workers who mostly didn't have automobiles had to live close enough to be able to walk to work. So no bank thought this was a reasonable proposal to build single-family homes in the suburbs. The only way that Levitt could build this project, or any of the other developers everywhere in the country who built suburban homes, a white noose, it turned out, ringing every metropolitan area, the only way they could build them is by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, getting a federal guarantee for their bank loans. In order to get that guarantee, they had to commit never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required Levitt and many of these other builders to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was explicit federal policy. It was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working in the FHA or VA. It was written out in a policy manual of the Federal Housing Administration called the Underwriting Manual that was given to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to recommend or not recommend applications of developers to build suburban projects. The manual said explicitly you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee the proposal of a developer who was going to sell to African Americans. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee the application of a developer who's going to build an all-white development if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because that would, in the words of the manual, run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the manual said. In Detroit, nearby, there was a developer of an all-white project who applied for a federal bank guarantee to build his project. And in my book, The Color of Law, I have a picture of a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall that this developer was required by the Federal Housing Administration to construct before they would guarantee his bank loan to build this project, because the wall was a barrier that would prevent African Americans who lived in a nearby neighborhood from being able to walk into this area. This was done all over the country. The homes at that time in these developments, like Leveetown and like all of the others, were inexpensive. They were for working class families, as I said, working middle class families. They sold at the time, they were modest homes of 750 square feet, selling at the time for about $8,000. In today's inflation adjusted money, that's about $100,000. Any working class family, any worker in the post-World War II period, black or white, who had a job in the post-war economy, could have afforded to buy a home for $100,000. $100,000 is twice national median income, with a 30-year mortgage or even a 20-year mortgage amortized. For returning war veterans, no down payment was required. Families could pay less in their monthly housing costs by living in one of these federally subsidized suburbs than they had been previously paying for rent in urban areas, even rent in public housing. Well, those homes, as you know, no longer sell for $100,000. Over the next couple of generations, the white families of Leveetown and all of these other suburbs and the white noose that I described gained wealth as their homes appreciated in value. They gained wealth because, and used it to send their children to college. They used it to finance temporary emergencies, perhaps, maybe temporary unemployment, maybe a health issue. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren. As their homes appreciated in value, they gained more and more equity, and that equity turned into the wealth that they could use for those purposes. The children and grandchildren who inherited this wealth were able to use it for down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from participating in this wealth-generating program. The result is that today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60% of white incomes, 60%. But African American wealth, which you would think would be 60% also, because families can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But African American wealth is not 60% of white wealth. African American wealth is only 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century. And that's never been remedied, and that we've never accepted an obligation to remedy. Well, that wealth gap determines much of the racial inequality that we have today. That federally constructed wealth gap determines our racial inequality. I have already described to you how the achievement gap in schools is attributable to the fact that so many African American families have no ability to move outside areas of concentrated poverty, because unlike white families, they don't have inherited wealth, multi-generational wealth. They don't have equity from previous home ownership, and so can't afford to move into higher opportunity communities. The wealth gap also determines the health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans, as you may know, have shorter life expectancies on average, greater rates of cardiovascular disease, because they live in less healthy neighborhoods, more polluted air, less access to grocery stores to sell fresh food. The wealth gap also contributes in a significant way to the mass incarceration of young Black men and to police abuse of African American men that we saw so many demonstrations about in the summer and spring of last year. I'm not suggesting that police would never abuse African Americans if it were not for the wealth gap and the concentration of African Americans in low-income segregated neighborhoods, but it would be much, much more minimized. Because of that concentration, there are large numbers of young men without jobs in the formal economy or access to those jobs, without access to schools that aren't overwhelmed, as I described before, by the social and economic problems of their students. And those kind of concentrations of young men, restive, inevitably engage in confrontations with the police. The police assume the stance of an occupying force in the same way that occupying forces in colonial countries in the 20th century, India, the Congo, any others, assumed the stance of an occupying force whose job it was to control a restive, disadvantaged, discriminated against population. And finally, the wealth gap, and this is just one policy that I'm talking about. The wealth gap has an important influence on something else that I find very frightening, dangerous, and perhaps you do as well, and that is the enormous political polarization that exists in this country today that largely tracks racial lines. It's not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to create the common national identity that's necessary to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to empathize with each other, no ability to understand each other's life experiences? How can we ever develop a common national identity under those circumstances? It's very, very difficult to imagine. Well, there were other policies as well that the federal government followed to create segregation. I'll mention one more, perhaps. and that's public housing. Most of us, I think, misunderstand public housing. We think public housing is a place where poor people live, lots of single mothers with children, lots of, as I said before, young men without jobs in the formal economy. But that's not how public housing began in this country. The first public housing in this country was created in the New Deal by the Roosevelt administration during the Depression of the 1930s. It was not for poor people. Poor people were not originally allowed into public housing. Public housing was for working families with good, stable employment records who had jobs. Of course, there was high unemployment in that period. It was the Depression. We had 25% unemployment at one point, but public housing was for the 75% who had good jobs, but who could not find housing because so little was being built during the Depression. As I mentioned earlier, we had many integrated neighborhoods, broadly integrated in the 20th century, early 20th century. Public housing was frequently used by the government to segregate those neighborhoods that hadn't previously been segregated. Maybe you're familiar with the great African-American poet, novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes. He describes in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. Said he dated a Jewish girl in high school. It was an integrated high school, an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration went into that neighborhood. It's called the Central Neighborhood of Cleveland. I don't know if any of you are from Cleveland. Called the Central Neighborhood of Cleveland. And it demolished some housing there and built two projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation that hadn't previously existed. It did the same thing elsewhere in the country. In my book, The Color of Law, I like to write where I can about the self-satisfied, smug places, think they're better than anybody else. One I talk about is Cambridge, Massachusetts. The area between Harvard and MIT was an integrated neighborhood. It's called the Central Square neighborhood in the 1930s, about half white, half black. Public Works Administration and other federal agencies in the 1930s demolished housing there and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. And it did that throughout the country with its public housing. During World War II, hundreds of thousands of workers, black and white, flocked to the West Coast to take jobs in shipyards and airplane factories that were producing material for the war effort. They overwhelmed the West Coast communities where they came to take these jobs. There were very few African Americans in particular on the West Coast prior to World War II. The migration of African Americans out of the former slave states that began in World War I was almost entirely concentrated on places like Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland, Pittsburgh, very few to the West Coast. But during World War II, they came to the West Coast to take jobs in the shipyards and the aircraft factories. They needed homes, they needed housing. The federal government had to build the housing if it wanted to have the ships and the planes produced, and so it did. In San Francisco, it built five projects rather, for war workers in the shipyards. Four were for whites only. One was for African Americans, and the placement of that project became the black neighborhood of San Francisco. Across the bay, the government built housing in Berkeley, California, for white workers. It built buildings along the residential area of Berkeley and a nearby suburb called Albany, and near shopping areas, separate buildings for whites. It built buildings for black war workers, shipyard workers in the same shipyards, working together in the same shipyards, built housing for them in the industrial area along the railroad tracks, far from shopping areas or the residential areas of those communities. And the same thing was done in Portland and Seattle and Los Angeles. That's how the West Coast came to be segregated, with World War II federal war housing projects for workers in war industries. Well, the policies to redress segregation are well known. There's no mystery about them. There's no think tanks and policy writers spin out policies all the time about what we can do to fix this. What's missing is not policy ideas. What's missing is a new civil rights movement. that's going to make it as uncomfortable to maintain patterns of racial segregation as the older civil rights movement made it uncomfortable to maintain patterns of lunch counter segregation or bus segregation. A new civil rights movement needs to do the same thing to address residential segregation in areas all over the country. I'm working with a group of national civil rights leaders and fair housing leaders to create something that they call a new movement to redress racial segregation, whose mission will be to create local committees in communities like yours to address fixing these problems of residential segregation that we've all inherited, but as American citizens that we have an obligation to fix. I can mention a couple of the policies. I don't know if this is possible actually, but I can ask the people who organized this meeting today if it's possible to send you information about how to get more information about this new movement to redress racial segregation. But I can mention a few policies of kinds of things it might do. I wrote a column a couple of months ago about a community in California, it happened to be, but you could do the same thing about suburban Detroit communities, an all-white community created for whites only in the 1940s. Easily affordable for African Americans at the time, but African Americans were excluded from that community. And in the column I wrote, I identified the bank, the real estate agency, and the developer that, with the cooperation of the federal government, built that community as an all-white community. And that bank, that real estate agency, that developer, still exists in that community today. A local civil rights group should be pressing that bank, that real estate agency, that developer, to create a voluntary reparations fund that subsidizes the movement of African Americans into the community that is now unaffordable to them, but that would have been affordable to their forebears had they been permitted to buy it. Again, if it's possible, I'll give the organizers of this meeting a link to that article, and you can see what I mean about the kind of activity that such a committee could undertake. The federal government maintains several policies today that reinforce racial segregation, particularly for low-income families, disproportionately African American, and in some cities now Hispanic as well. The biggest policy, the biggest program that the federal government has for reinforcing segregation is the low-income housing tax credit. It's a tax credit that the U.S. Treasury Department distributes to states, who then in turn distribute it to developers to build housing for lower income families who are disproportionately African American and Hispanic. The Treasury Department places a premium in its regulations on building low-income housing tax credit units in existing low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. I'm not saying we shouldn't build any better housing in those neighborhoods. Of course we should. Every neighborhood should have better housing. But to place a premium on placing housing in those neighborhoods, rather than placing more of it in high opportunity places where there's access to good jobs and transportation and clean air and grocery stores that sell fresh food and schools that aren't overwhelmed with the social and economic problems of their students, that's where we should be putting more of them. Today, we place very few of them in those kinds of neighborhoods. So we reinforce segregation with this policy. Another one you may have heard of, the Section 8 voucher program, also reinforces segregation. The Section 8 voucher program is designed so that families who need assistance in paying rent, because rents are so high that even if they spend 30% of their income, these are working families, even if they spend 30% of their income, they can't find any housing to rent. And so the program is designed to supplement 30% of these families' incomes with a voucher that they can use to rent apartments at market rates. But the market rates are calculated as an average across a metropolitan area. And it doesn't take a genius to recognize that the average rent, or median rent actually, to be precise, the median rent in a metropolitan area is going to be too low to rent apartments in high opportunity communities like the ones I just described. It's also going to be too high to rent apartments in low income segregated neighborhoods. So landlords exploit the program by charging more than the market requires in those neighborhoods. But low income neighborhoods are the only places that the vouchers are effectively usable for most families. And so it reinforces segregation. It's also the case that landlords are still permitted under the Fair Housing Act to refuse to accept families who have subsidies for their housing. That form of discrimination is not prohibited by the Fair Housing Act. And so the combination of vouchers that are too low and landlords who discriminate against Section 8 vouchers, voucher holders, reinforces segregation in the same way that the low-income housing tax credit does so. There are many, many policies that also continue to reinforce segregation. As you know, in most states, or maybe you don't know, but most states, if you're going to record something, conversation, you need the consent of both parties. But there are some states where you don't. New York State is one state where the consent of another party for you to record a conversation you're having with that party is not required. And so in New York, a newspaper fitted testers, that is, applicants for housing who went to real estate agents to seek housing, black and white, with identical financial records, job histories, and so forth. They were indistinguishable except for their race. And they fitted these applicants with hidden cameras, little buttonhole cameras, so they could record the conversations. And what they discovered, and the newspaper published, and again, I can send you the link to this article, it's fascinating. What the newspaper published were conversations with real estate agents in this day and age, in which a black applicant was shown homes in black neighborhoods, a white applicant was shown home in white neighborhoods. Black applicants were told if they wanted to look at a home in a white neighborhood, oh, you wouldn't be comfortable there. This is ongoing discrimination that is easily ferreted out. You don't need a hidden camera. You can take notes with this kind of testing program, but we should be doing this all over the country. We should be doing it in Grand Rapids and in Detroit and in Chicago and in New York to clean up the real estate industry so it stops reinforcing segregation. Every one of these real estate agents who practices discrimination, and not all real estate agents do, I'd say most don't, but too many do, every one of them is licensed by state government. So this is also an extension of state action in perpetuating and reinforcing segregation. It would be not a difficult thing for state government, state licensing agencies, to be more aggressive in monitoring the behavior of the real estate industry so that it didn't perpetuate and reinforce racial segregation. Well, as I say, the policies are well known, things we can do to redress segregation. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to engage in direct action, perhaps, and mobilization to change the political climate that make it possible to redress segregation. And let me say one final thing. I'm very hopeful. So long as we believed that racial segregation happened by accident, it would be very hard. It was very hard to figure out how to fix it. But now that we know, and let me say that my book describing this history has been out for 4 years now, and not a single fact that I described to you or that's in the book has been challenged by a professional historian. Now that we know that this was created by government, it's easy to understand that government can also uncreate it, if only the political will exists to do that. And I'm hoping that you'll join with others in this country to help create that political will. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to having your questions and answering them if I can. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Rothstein. Very informative. One of your lines is running through my head continuously. Run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups on government documents. Okay.
Mhm.
So we do have a couple questions here. One of them from a person who is anonymous says, it looks like I think you addressed this at the 42-minute mark, but besides a lack of enforcement of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, especially with realtors and banks, do you have examples of de jure policy segregation after 1968?
Yes. Yeah. Is that a question?
That is a question.
Yes. This is an example of government failure to enforce the constitutional or civil rights of African Americans and in particular Hispanics. You probably know about the subprime lending crisis, which is the most extreme example of this kind of behavior. Banks exploited African American and Hispanic homeowners by aggressively marketing only to them, or that's an exaggeration, mainly to them, mainly to African American and Hispanic homeowners, disproportionately to them, exploitative refinance loans. There were court suits in which it was shown that bank executives sent mortgage salesmen out to black churches on Sundays to try to get parishioners to take out new mortgages on their homes. The new mortgages had low initial teaser interest rates that then exploded a few years later in small print. And when the interest rate suddenly doubled, tripled, the homeowners could no longer maintain payments on their homes. They lost their homes and they were foreclosed. And the black home ownership rate dropped precipitously during that subprime lending crisis. Every one of those banks that engaged in this kind of behavior is a regulated institution. Banks are the most heavily regulated institution in this country. The Federal Reserve system regulates banks. The controller of the currency regulates banks. All of these federal agencies turned a blind eye to this kind of practice, and it did enormous damage to African American communities, in violation of the Fair Housing Act, of course.
Right. I'd like to, before I forget, I want to mention to you and to the people viewing that if you have links you'd like to share, you can share them with me or Jane Bruin, and we'll make sure that we get them out to the audience. Okay, the next question, another anonymous question asker. When I try to explain to my white friends and colleagues issues of systemic racism, such as housing, wealth, and racial inequalities, much of what I say either goes over their head because of the complexity of the issue, or they take offense and refuse to entertain the idea whatsoever because they view it as an attack on their identity, whether racial or political. How can I better communicate and bridge the gap with my peers about this important issue?
Well, I try my best to stick to the facts. I just describe what happened. And my experience is that when you describe the facts, um, they're incontrovertible. And as I said, no historian has challenged this story that I told you this afternoon. This is not an attack on white people. White people didn't do this. It was the government that did it. This is an unconstitutional system. And it actually harms whites as much as African Americans. I indicated before, just one aspect of that our democracy is under threat because we live in such a segregated system. But the fact that we're polarized racially also leads in this country to much less adequate public services than other industrialized countries have, because too many people are afraid that people of the other race are going to benefit if they support the kinds of services that people in other countries take for granted, whether it's healthcare that doesn't put people in bankruptcy, or better retirement, more comfortable retirement systems, or good roads, transportation. Our public sector is impoverished because of our extreme political, which is largely racial polarization. So this is a system that harms whites as well as African Americans. And I don't think any white person should take offense at this. No individual white person did this. This was done by our government. And we all have an obligation as American citizens to redress it. You know, I'll say one more thing. I indicated this earlier. You know, I don't like to accept invitations to speak in Black History Month, because it's not Black history. This is the history of all of us. And we all have an obligation as American citizens to work together to redress it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm gonna wait here. Let's see if I have another. Okay. All right. Ken A asks, what might be some positive examples we could look into, localities in the U.S. or abroad, of how changes have been made?
Well, I think the best examples are here. There's no other country that has no other industrialized country comparable to the United States that has the legacies of slavery and segregation that we have. Other countries deal with minorities and they have difficulty doing so. You know, they're mostly recent immigrants. We have recent immigrants here too, but the biggest problems we have are the people who were here in this country, whose ancestors were here long before most of the rest of us were, involuntarily, but here. This is a unique problem the United States has. But where I take hope from is how we've dealt with some of these problems in the past. We have had a civil rights movement that was reasonably successful. And as you can tell by looking at me, I'm an old man. I've seen things change in this country that were considered inconceivable before they happened. I'll tell you, Lionel, can I tell you one short story? Do I have time? Yeah, one short story.
Yes, sir, you have time.
All right. In the 1960s, I was a research assistant at the Chicago Urban League. And one of the things I was asked to do was to determine what share of the policy-making positions in the corporate sector of Chicago, where there's about a 35% African-American population, what share of the policy-making positions in the corporate sector of Chicago were held by African-Americans at that time. And there was no internet in those days. The only way you could do that research is there were these giant manuals like this big and this thick that listed every company and listed the phone number of the personnel director or the shipping and receiving director. And so I had to count them up and identify who held those positions and identify them by race. And I counted up 4,000 such positions, 4,000 policy-making positions in the corporate sector of Chicago. So in 1964 or 65, when I did this, of those 4,000 positions, how many do you think were held by African Americans? Anybody have a guess?
Out of 4,000?
Yeah.
1,000?
Okay, 1,000. That would be 25% in a city with 35% African American population. Well, of those 4,000 policy-making positions in the corporate sector of Chicago, not a single one was held by an African American. Not a single one.
Wow.
Now, if you had told me then that within a generation, you couldn't have a corporation in Chicago without a diverse executive suite, I'd say you were crazy. Nothing like that could happen. But it did. And it did because there was a civil rights movement in this country that changed things dramatically. It didn't change everything. It didn't, as I said in the talk I gave, it didn't change anything about residential segregation. In some areas, things have gotten worse. Mass incarceration is much worse now than it was in the 1960s. But in many areas, it's gotten much better. And the opportunities for African Americans to have middle-class jobs in the mainstream economy is one example of that. There are many, many other examples. So I'm hopeful that things can change, but they won't change on their own. They'll change only if there's a new civil rights movement that makes it necessary for this country to confront its obligations to enforce the constitutional rights of people whose rights have been abridged.
Thank you, sir. So I just got a 5-minute warning. I got 2 questions I'd like to try to squeeze in. The first, another from Ken asks, what were the most common stated reasons for government housing segregation? And then I'm going to just throw the other one in there. Tess asks, do you have the most hope for policy changes at the municipal, state, or federal level?
Okay, I'm going to start with the second. My expectation is it's going to change first locally and then build up from there. That's the way social change starts. It doesn't start from the top down. And that's why when we organize this new movement to redress racial segregation, our focus is not going to be on trying to change federal policy. Our focus is going to be on creating local committees that are going to take action in their local communities to redress segregation. As I indicated, I'm going to make available to you a link to an article that describes exactly how that might happen in one example of that kind. As I said, I'm an old man. I have a short memory. What was the first question?
First question was,
the
first question was, what were the most common stated reasons for government housing segregation? We have 1 minute and 30 seconds.
All right. The most common stated reason was that property values were going to decline if African Americans moved into a white neighborhood. It was utter nonsense. The Federal Housing Administration knew that it was utter nonsense, because in fact, property values increased when African Americans moved into a white neighborhood, because African Americans had a shorter supply relative to their demand of housing, that they were willing to pay more for housing of similar quality than whites were willing to pay. And if you had a white suburb that where a homeowner wanted to move, maybe got a better job, maybe had a larger family, it was to his interest to sell to an African American rather than to a white family. They would pay more, and if you went into these neighborhoods, you would see that the best kept homes in the neighborhood were the rare ones that were sold, that were held by African Americans, if they weren't driven out by the kind of violence that I described. So that the stated reason was not accurate, not true. The Federal Housing Administration had this research. It knew it wasn't true, but it perpetuated this nonsense anyway.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank you, Mr. Rothstein, for joining us today. This concludes our Black History Month series, Reimagining Black History Month, sponsored by the Center for Intercultural Student Development. My name is Lionel Legrand. Thank you for joining us, and everybody have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.